how do you make sure your ally really fights with you and won't turn against you at some point? I mean, what if they have a completely alien culture, an alien religion, an alien everything? Well, if you can't force them to help, you offer them something they can't resist. The Entente forces in 1915 were well aware of that, and that's why Britain offered Russia the prize of prizes. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, we took a look at the typhus epidemic that was ravaging Serbia and preventing foreign attacks there. The Austro-Hungarian army was fighting the Russians high in the Carpathian Mountains, but going nowhere at a terrible cost in men. Further north, the Germans were regrouping to attack Russia in Poland, and in the west, the British had tried and failed to break through the German lines at Neuve-Chapelle. The French had been busy with their Champagne offensive, a continuous series of battles that began before last Christmas. Now, on March 17th, it ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The Champagne offensive was the first Allied offensive since the battles of Ypres and Yser last fall, and it highlighted changing strategies. French General Joseph Joffre had been pursuing a policy of concentrated attacks against tactical and strategic targets. But the British battle at Neuve-Chapelle highlighted what was now Britain's grab and hold philosophy, to bite off a chunk of territory in a wider attack with longer and heavier artillery barrages, and then hold it against counterattacks. But so far, neither of these modes of attack had yet been effective, and after nearly 3 months of the Champagne offensive, the stalemate in the trenches continues. French losses for the winter are estimated at 400,000 casualties. But the Allies had high hopes for breaking the deadlock elsewhere in Europe, specifically the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, on March 18th, what was intended to be a turning point in the war happened as British and French naval forces tried to force the Dardanelles. First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill expected his ships to quickly push right through the Straits of the Dardanelles into the Sea of Marmara and then caused total panic in the Ottoman capital Istanbul when a whole bunch of foreign warships suddenly appeared off the coast. That panic, including the evacuation of all troops to the Asian side of the city. The British planned on using ships alone to achieve this. Foreign Secretary Edward Grey even told the War Council that he believed that the naval success achieved at the Dardanelles might result in a coup in Istanbul and a new government would bring back Ottoman neutrality once again. Other ministers thought the victory would persuade Greece, Romania, or Bulgaria to join the Entente. Once through to the Black Sea, the Royal and French navies could link up with their Russian counterpart for an assault up the Danube into Austria-Hungary. This was suddenly the most obvious strategy to winning the war to everybody. And then there were the spoils. Secretary of State for War Lord Kitchener wanted Britain to annex Aleppo and Alexandretta. Alexandretta especially had a large Christian population and was a major Ottoman rail center. The Admiralty wanted to annex the whole Euphrates River Valley all the way down to Basra to prevent the Russians getting a foot or a ship into the Persian Gulf. And in return, when the Ottomans were defeated, Russia would get Armenia, the Bosporus, and the Turkish capital itself, Istanbul. Greece, if she joined the war, would get Smyrna. Italy, if she helped out, would get Adana in the south. France would receive Syria and part of Lebanon. So everybody supported the Dardanelles invasion for a variety of selfish reasons. But they all actually depended on success, which the naval attack on the 18th nearly was. In hours, the forts covering the minefields in the Sea of Marmara and the mines themselves were swept out of action. The fleet advanced, and there were only 9 lines of mines remaining, all identified and all ready for sweeping, between the fleet and the fort of Chanak at the Narrows. However, one more line. A single line of 20 mines had been laid by a Turkish steamboat 10 days earlier, and this changed everything. 3 of the 10 Allied battleships were sunk, the British Irresistible and Ocean and the French Bouvet. Another one was beached and yet another put out of action. The attack was a failure. Churchill wanted to continue the attack the following day, but bad weather postponed it, and when heads had cooled, the senior British personnel decided it would be best to put the army ashore in the future and attack the remaining forts from the rear. You know what's funny? To prevent Russia from having Istanbul, The British had gone to war in 1854, the Crimean War, and in 1878 had sent a fleet through the Dardanelles to again warn off the Russians. And now, if a British attack were successful, Russia would take the great prize. Russia was trying for another prize this week, actually, the fortress of Przemyśl, which she'd had under siege for 4 months now, in which an Austro-Hungarian army, 120,000 strong, held out far behind enemy lines. Over the past 6 weeks, Franz Joseph's Imperial Austro-Hungarian army had launched 2 offensives against the Russians, with a major objective being to break that siege. On March 14th, the second offensive ground to a halt. The Russian numerical superiority had begun to tell. In the first half of March, the Austrian Second Army had suffered over 50,000 casualties out of fewer than 150,000 men. The main cause of the losses, to put it bluntly, was human sacrifice. Now, that's the only way to describe it. Human sacrifice. Because the majority of the Austrian losses came from direct frontal attacks against strong Russian defenses and with no artillery support. But you know, it was really tragedy upon tragedy. And most of the time, even transporting wounded soldiers to the rear was an exercise in futility because even the lightly wounded often froze to death. So the second offensive failed, and indeed a day later the Russians actually broke the Austrian center near Smolensk. But the question still had to be asked: what of Przemyśl? Well, the garrison there was at the end of its tether. So on March the 16th, Austrian Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf launched a third Carpathian offensive. And on March the 19th, the army trapped in Przemyśl, who'd been living off of horse meat and bread fillers for months, attempted to break out. This attempt was a huge and very bloody failure. There had actually been no realistic chance for its success, but it had been ordered by telegram by Conrad to protect the honor of the Austro-Hungarian army. It later developed that Russian code breakers had cracked the Austrian codes and knew all about the breakout attempt in advance. Things were actually looking pretty good for Russia all week long, even in the far north, where at the beginning of the week, the Germans had launched a new offensive near Przasnysz. But on the 12th and 13th, the Russians stopped them handily and then mounted a counteroffensive the 15th. For the next week, the battle raged, and with no fewer than 46 assaults, until the Germans were pushed back from their objective of cutting the railway between Warsaw and Petrograd. Okay, when I was researching this episode, I found a mention on a Wikipedia page that said the Russians, at that battle, were the first ever to break a defensive line with an armored division. Now, I can't find it again, though, and, well, it was Wikipedia anyhow, and I haven't found it anywhere else. But if any of you have any info on this, please let us know, because it would be really interesting if this was true. And at the end of the week, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps were training hard in Egypt for future deployment at the Dardanelles. Their supply boxes, their orders, their papers, their everything was stamped A and NZAC, and thus the nickname ANZAC for their armed forces stuck and eventually was immortalized. Also this week, the German cruiser Dresden was sunk. It was the final remnant of the German East Asia Squadron. And there we stand. An end of an era with the German Pacific Navy destroyed and the Champagne offensive over. The beginning of an era as the Entente tries to break through the Dardanelles and continued Austrian desperation in the Carpathians. I was going to talk about Russia and the possibility of Russia gaining control of Istanbul and the entrance to the Black Sea, but I'm not going to. I'm going to use this time instead to make a brief mention of the historian Sir Martin Gilbert, who passed away February 3rd, 2015. 100 years in the future. Gilbert was a historian of both world wars and was the official biographer of Winston Churchill. But it was his work on the First World War, specifically his book of that name, that was a major inspiration for and influence on this channel. Thank you, Martin. This show would not exist without you. Rest in peace. If you guys have interesting sources, stories, and suggestions for us, you can share them with us at any time. We're always looking for inspiration for biographies and special episodes. So check out our special on trench warfare right here. You can also head over to our subreddit, where you can find amazing answers to historical questions, not only by me and the team, but also from other fans. Thanks a lot for that. See you next week.